Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. I feel like I've had a very changing relationship with this Hobbit franchise, from being the first one, which is a film I had to see in a certain format and a certain theater, and was very important to me that I see that film, to a film franchise that I'm seeing out of both habit and duty to a previous franchise, and I don't really like as much, but I see anyway. I feel like a lot of people feel that way about these films. This film is probably the one I liked the most overall, but I still feel like that's not really saying much, and it's still a film that has a lot of problems. It's still a film that has far too much CG in it. It doesn't have the urgency and the accessibility to it that the previous franchise had, and almost feels like a more tired director than Peter Jackson should probably be at this point in his filmography and his career. It shows more of a Hollywood phoniness than I would have expected from someone who had directed the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It doesn't feel as emotional. It doesn't feel like I've really been through something. Looking at this versus Return of the King, which is incredibly unfair, but also brings up the point to why that franchise is considered one of the greatest film trilogies of all time, and The Hobbit is just a big money-making movie every Christmas holiday season, because I didn't really feel like I was going through anything. Most of the reviews I read, the headlines were always like, well, it's finally over. And that doesn't show me that culturally these were like our old friends. These films have always had the problem at trying to get the audience into them. It kind of just assumes we'll fall in love with them, and it's not really helping us as the audience in any way. This film is a little more streamlined, works better as a movie than the previous two, which are trying to accomplish probably too much, but it's still the third part in a franchise that isn't really working. Overly long, bloated, and CGI'd out. These films are going to be far more remembered for its Hollywood excess than its actual storytelling. It starts off with Smaug going off and destroying the town of Lake Town, and he's just left the cave from the last Hobbit film, so if you haven't seen that film you will be particularly lost. And that happens actually rather quickly enough that it's like the cold open of the movie, because right after that they go to the Battle of the Five Armies, which kind of makes me wonder why they didn't have that in the last movie. It was so quick. I like some of those sequences with the Smaug stuff, but Smaug was not really in it that much. It just wasn't really that long of a sequence. It opens the movie nicely, but it just didn't feel like it flowed with the rest of the story. It really felt like I was still watching part two. And then they move on to, you know, now the dwarves are in the cave, and they have all these coins and stuff, and then Thorin has dragon sickness, and then word gets out that Smaug is gone and been killed by Bard the Bowman, and Lake Town's been destroyed by Smaug, and so the Lake Town people want to be able to settle in the cave for shelter because winter is coming. They were promised some gold because they helped out the dwarves, but Thorin is a jerk and has dragon sickness. He refuses to do that. Then the elves show up because the elves have shit with the dwarves. Then the orcs show up because the Lonely Mountain Castle thing, strategically it'll give them an advantage. And then a dwarf army shows up with Billy Connolly, which that was one of the weirdest parts. So all these armies are converging, and it's kind of like four. Then the eagles show up, so I guess that's a fifth one, but it's like not enough. I don't know how many people are considered an army. You know how like three's company but four is a crowd, so how many are an army? Not really five armies, because I think they cut an army, like a wolf army, but then there's another orc army, so do like the orcs count twice? I'm a little confused about all these armies. There's a lot of them, and they have these epic battle sequence to determine a lot of things, because there's 5 of them. One of the things about Lord of the Rings, if there's a sequence that was just them walking somewhere or doing something that wasn't a scene that was incredibly interesting or exciting, Peter Jackson would shoot it in a really dynamic, interesting way. So it would seem a lot more exciting than most directors would shoot it. And in this film, the camera doesn't move as much. It's a lot more stilted. The cinematography isn't as interesting, especially when it's a sequence that isn't an action sequence. When it's an action sequence, he seems kind of similar to the old Peter Jackson. In this film, he feels like more like a bloated Hollywood director who wants all this excess, doesn't care as much about storytelling as he does all these loose ends that don't really work. He's kind of concentrating in all these areas that aren't actually helping story. That he's included all the appendices and all these other things to be included into this movie. It's kind of choking The Hobbit, the story, from really being The Hobbit, and also making it try to be Lord of the Rings. Rings, which I think if any of the parts of The Hobbit could be like Lord of the Rings, I guess it would be this battle. So that might be why this film works a lot better. Including all that stuff has made it just so dodgy of a film. There's a lot of things I wish he had cut, like the mayor guy played by Stephen Fry. The Lakestown stuff doesn't work as well. I wish they'd like kind of demoted that. And then his like henchman guy who's like comic relief in this. This is just a straight on like Disney sidekick, and he wasn't very funny. It didn't really help the movie at all. It didn't motivate the story. It was completely worthless, and the actor really wasn't that great at it. He was just like annoying and stupid, and I was kind of hoping they would kill him or like an orc would eat him. A lot of the other films were doing this Lord of the Rings prequel thing, and I get like that's what Gandalf was doing, but I kind of like don't care what Gandalf was doing. Those Lord of the Rings prequel parts aren't as heavy in this film. There's certain scenes like when Legolas's dad is like, oh, there's a ranger, he's called Strider, but his real name's Aragorn. That was really heavy-handed. The stuff with like the early ghostly ring race was also a little silly. That was the parts of this film franchise that I really dislike, is trying too much to be a prequel to Lord of the Rings, which The Hobbit is. There's parts like the Nithrael when that gets given to Bilbo, that actually didn't feel like a prequel to Lord of the Rings, oddly enough. That felt like, oh yeah, because Bilbo gets this in the book. I understand this. All the other stuff that was very much like, oh, this is a prequel to Lord of the Rings crap, really felt flat and felt almost like, you know, the famous Simpsons line, well, that was the origin of that. Just felt really overbearing. There was one part where Gandalf was talking about how this was going to be a problem to Legolas's dad and Bard's the Bowman, and they kind of look at each other like, we have bigger stuff to deal with. It's almost like the movie was like, hey, shut up about this Lord of the Rings crap. It's like the movie became self-aware. It was like, nobody's really into this. Before you have a Gandalf story and a Hobbit story, too many things going on at once that are going in different directions. And in this film, when they're all going together, it's really working. That's why I probably prefer this film. It has all the bloat and the action sequences are a little too much, and it doesn't have the showmanship and the understanding on how to stage action sequences and how to show a character can do something special, and when they do it, it's impressive and amazing. In Return of the King, the elephants, when they show up, it's this big dramatic moment, and so many different stupid characters show up in so many different stupid ways that it's like not dramatic anymore. It just washes over you. You're like, oh look, there's another weird thing. There's some bats, there's an eagle, there's an orc, there's a troll, there's a troll that has a thing on his head that breaks down a wall. That was like my favorite troll guy, was the guy who had the thing on his head and then he breaks it down and then he passes out. I was like, man, that guy is the best job ever. And then he just gets to sleep. What a great guy. And he's probably not very smart because he's lost a lot of brain cells breaking down walls. Laziness wise, he's very smart. Too much going on, and when you overload the senses with that stuff, your sense of drama and your sense of everything is gone. So much has been said about how these films are like the Star Wars prequel trilogy, and it shows a director who's overloading with CGI and comfort and doesn't care as much about story. And I would say those are all true. I mean, look at the framing in this compared to Lucas's framing when he was overusing CGI. Peter Jackson's used more and more special effects as he's continued as a filmmaker. In some places he can be really inventive and very smart with his use of special effects, but when he's just overloading it with it and its whole plasticky feel, I don't know if that's because it was shot in 48 frames and brought down, the weird color correction they've done to it, the bad CGI they have in it, this is just an excessively awfully looking movie. From someone who made a really beautiful, amazing spectacle Hollywood films with Lord of the Rings, this is the bad kind of excessive spectacle that people hate and don't really appreciate that much. You're just watching them to watch them, and I think that's the problem with the Hobbit films. They're films you watch just to watch. People love them because they love the source material. If these weren't based on anything and you had just seen these and hadn't read the books, you wouldn't really give a shit. And The Hobbit is giving that genre and that kind of big budget filmmaking a bad name. It's kind of like a horror sequel. Think of Halloween 6, think of Nightmare on Elm Street 6, think of Friday the 13th Part 6. Is that the final chapter? Or is that New Beginning? The point is, when you've made that many sequels and they're not good, you have besmirched the good name of the original films. And that's really what these films have done. If I had not seen Return of the King since 2003 or 2004, I would go, God, I don't want to go to Middle Earth for like forever. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Sure, this film is actually entertaining, and I think the battle stuff shows Peter Jackson's excessive action sequences in kind of a plus way, in the way that they kind of work a lot more. I mean, certainly if you're going to be excessive about a battle sequence, the Battle of the Five Armies kind of plays into that, so it works for it. It's still excessive in the wrong way. It's not excessive in a fun way, it's just excessive in a manageable way. It's like he wants to push it even further in a way that this story was never ready to do. The Hobbit is a simpler story. I think it shows his excess as a filmmaker. This does kind of show a richer, more comfortable director, and that does remind me of Lucas. But it also feels like he's nervous and comfortable. He's nervous, so he puts all these extra things in, but he's comfortable in a way that he's not going to dynamically film them. The Hobbit films have been a real disappointment of a franchise from a director I used to really love, and from a franchise I used to really love. And I think Peter Jackson has fallen off quicker than I've seen any director fallen off in recent memory, in more of an epic scale than I can think of. I think The Hobbit is a good story, but I think the way Peter Jackson tried to make it more like Lord of the Rings and tried to direct it on this excessive epic scale kind of ultimately failed them. And he's gotten excessive in a way that's ridiculous, because he used to make these extended editions for Lord of the Rings, all of which work very well and the flow works, and even if they're ridiculously long, they're amazing to watch, and it's like the movie's even better. He's made The Hobbit in such an excessively long way, and those even have extended editions on top of that. He made so many well-made, really long films, it feels like every film he makes now has to be an incredibly really long film, but that feels like he doesn't know when to stop and what to include and what not to include. And he used to have more of a sense to that. He's including all this crap that shouldn't be in there. We all just wanted a simple story of a hobbit getting a ring, stealing some gold, and a dragon getting killed. And hopefully at some point someone will make one really good Hobbit movie. But I think the thing about Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, people used to say they were unfilmable, because no one could manage to do that. When Bakshi made his Lord of the Rings and Rankin Bass made their Return of the King, it kind of helped those films be unfilmable. It showed that you could not make a successful adaptation of that. And I think Peter Jackson's done that with The Hobbit, and he's shown that he has not made a successful adaptation of The Hobbit, and that someone could still come and remake The Hobbit and do a much better job, and people would be probably fine with that, much like how Bakshi and Rankin Bass left that door open for Peter Jackson. Hopefully another director will come up with the inventiveness to do that with The Hobbit. But until then, we have this that Peter Jackson has left the door open for, with his forgettable, excessive, bloated trilogy that was The Hobbit. So if you have seen The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to.